Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Spouter-Inn, where we've got a very lovely conversation to share with you.
Yeah, I'm so happy that we had the opportunity to speak with John Nicholas, who's a member of Munsee-Delaware Nation, about a book that had been written by his parents called Cry of the Ancients.
Yeah, you mentioned that in our recent episode. It sounded very interesting and exciting, and you had a lovely conversation where you bring up that book and some of the interesting decisions that might go into how to represent that book to the world so many years later.
Exactly. It's a book that came out in 1974, as we'll hear. And in some cases, you might think, oh, it just makes sense just to reissue, reprint a volume, unchanged from what it had been before. But a lot has changed and the community's perspective on it has shifted. So one of the things we talk about is how to represent it in an oral form or written form, with commentary, without it. And I feel like that's a conversation that is something that we might end up carrying forward in other contexts, thinking about written forms versus oral forms. We talk about story or what we might call fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah, and there's also threads to some other conversations we've been having. He was part of the group that was doing some of the museum work that you talked about in Europe recently.
That's right. And it's great to have the opportunity to reflect on that together and put that into conversation with the kind of work that was being done back in the 70s and earlier by members of his family.
All right. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's sit back and listen to Suzanne talking with John Nicholas.
Listeners, thank you for joining us. I'm really happy that we're here today to talk together with John Nicholas, who's a member of Munsee-Delaware Nation and a good friend and fellow researcher, to talk a little bit about a book that his parents created a number of years ago now called Cry of the Ancients. And this book was published back in 1974, but it's clearly the product of many years of thought, of experience, and of knowledge that was passed on over time. So, John, I wonder if maybe you might introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners, and we'll talk about the book.
Yes, thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate your inviting me to participate. My name is John Nicholas, and I'm the last of 14 children raised by my mother and father, Gray Owl and Little Pigeon. And as you mentioned, I'm a member of the Munsee-Delaware Nation and a member of the Turtle Clan. I have worked in federal government, in the United States federal government, for about 30 years before retiring in 2003. And worked in the fire service in Washington State for about 13 years before retiring from there. So now my wife and I live in the Netherlands and am enjoying life as an expat over here.
Yeah, and being there worked out so well for us when we did that research trip together last June, when we had the opportunity to visit with belongings from your community and other Munsee communities in German museums.
Yes, that was an exciting experience for me.
Yeah, I hope we'll get a chance to bring that into the conversation. There are some parts of your parents' book that talk a little bit about museums and how one often interacts with them and how that might be better. And I wonder if that'll be an opportunity for us to connect what's shared in the book to our own experience. And the other thing we've had the chance to do together over the last couple of years is work together on the Munsee Language and History Symposia that have been happening in Princeton for a few years now. And I'm so glad you're able to come to this year's gathering.
Oh, I have to say, it was difficult for me initially to get my head wrapped around the idea of so many Munsees gathered in one place at one time.
Yeah. For people who are less familiar with Munsee communities, maybe we could just say a couple words about that. I'll say just something kind of general, which is that many people might have heard of Lenape, or sometimes called Lenape Nation. And these are people whose traditional territories are in the area that's now southern New York, New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and northern Delaware. But many of the people now are living in sometimes described as a Lenape diaspora that goes from Oklahoma to Wisconsin, Kansas, and Ontario. And Munsee is one of the two languages that are spoken by Lenape people, Munsee and Wanami. And your community, John, is one of the ones that are Munsee speakers. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about Munsee-Delaware Nation specifically.
Well, Munsee-Delaware Nation is situated on a very small tract of land, about a mile in area, about 120 miles northeast of Detroit, Michigan. And there are currently about 130 tribal members who reside in that tract, and about 400 of us who live off reservation in various parts of the country and the world.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why, whether people are gathering back at Munsee-Delaware Nation for the annual gathering in July, or whether it's an opportunity to gather on traditional homelands, as we've been doing in the fall every year since 2021 down in the Princeton area, it's really great when people have a chance to come together and share knowledge. And the case of our last gathering, actually spend time in the museum with belongings that were collected from the community well over 100 years ago.
Yes, it was an opportunity for us at this symposium to visit with some of the ancestor items in the American Museum of Natural History.
Yeah. And at the same symposium, we also had a session that was on Lenape books. And one of the things that I felt was so wonderful about that session is, while in the past we've had the opportunity to talk about old books, that is, to go to Princeton University Library special collections and look at items from, a few hundred years ago, this session was instead about Lenape books right now. That is, books that Munsee people either have published recently or are soon to bring to publication, or in the case of your parents' book, are thinking about how to make a book that was published some years ago available again. And this is a great opportunity for us to talk about the book and maybe start that process.
Well, I've been engaged in some discussion with family members about the idea, given that the book is currently out of print, the idea of going for reprinting or republication of the book. Those discussions are still ongoing. But we've also discussed other ways in which to make the contents of the book available through recordings and such to people who don't have access to the book. You could find the book online. I know that there were a couple of books available through Amazon, and I believe through eBay. You can do a search for Cry of the Ancients.
But it's not widely available.
Not widely available at all. It's almost what you might call one of the rare books.
Yeah, no, exactly. It was such an interesting experience for me to get exposed to this book. And it came because when we were together doing that research trip this past June, when we were in Germany together, you talked a little bit about a particular part of the book where it was in your father's own words. And then I think, if I remember correctly, you shared a few paragraphs of that with me in an email, and that led me to then go seek out the book and to read it. And it was such an interesting experience because, on the one hand, it's clearly very much a product of its particular place and time. It was published in 1974, and I can imagine reading it in the context of the American Indian movement and other kinds of sort of social and political circumstances of that time. So I could sort of see it there. But then also I was really struck by a number of moments in the book that really seemed to speak to the present, and to be addressing questions like who talks for, as the book puts it, the Indians, right? Who's the one to kind of explain the history? Who's the one to kind of tell us what we're looking at? And there's this one passage that I was particularly struck by. It's at the end of chapter 15. And and the book says this: "Let us have the evidence of the Indian himself. Let us try a startling new method of investigation. Instead of formulating an opinion and telling the Indian what was history, let us ask him, with honest sincerity and even a certain humility, and be prepared to accept the truth, even if it upsets our theories of migrations." I thought in that passage, even though it's talking specifically about migration theory, which, interestingly enough, is actually being reconsidered in scholarly circles, it's really kind of pointing a finger at the crucial problem, which is like who speaks for the community, who's going to be doing the interpretation, and this comes up over and over again in this book.
Yes, and I think one of the questions that our young people face today, not just on our reservation in Munsee, Delaware, but I've had the opportunity through my work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to visit reservations all over the United States and speak with a number of young folks. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there is a great hunger among them, looking for answers as to who they are and where they come from in particular. What must one do or be in order to be able to claim that heritage? And so one of the things that the book goes a long way, I think, toward trying to answer is who we are, where we come from, and what we hold in common in terms of life goals and principles.
Yeah, I was really struck by the ways in which the book, at one and the same time, is very specific in kind of what community this knowledge is rooted in, making reference back to Munsee-Delaware, and that's the kind of point of reference. And yet there's also passages that will talk about other indigenous nations of Turtle Island or North America, not to overlook the differences that separate each one of these communities from the other, but to point out commonalities. So it's really a beautiful balance of specificity and that broader view.
Yes. One thing that I'd kind of like to point to in particular is the fact that for many people who have the chance to pick up the book and read through it, is that for me, it's not so much when I read the book, it's not so much reading the simple text that you see before you, but it's remembering the things that my mother and father taught us as siblings growing up. These were daily lessons that we were taught. And in some ways, it's a source of great pride. And in other ways, it's kind of a bit of a pain to think that there are others who did not have the opportunities that I did. I think one of the things that we might want to discuss is what is it about the book, and particularly the authors of the book, that kind of sets it apart. My father, for those who I don't think would know, was the last hereditary chief of the Munsee-Delaware Nation. That means at one time that his father and his father before him passed on the responsibility for leadership of the tribe. Unlike today, where the chief of the Munsee-Delaware Nation is an office that you elect once every 2 years.
Yeah, I was really struck by the time when your father must have experienced that transition. That is, I was looking back to see when changes in legislation led to either the choice or the imposition of having elected chief and council at Munsee-Delaware and other indigenous nations in the region. And it seems like that's already happening in the late 1800s, that transition to elected chief and council. And yet it must be the case that the traditional way of doing things was also persisting side by side for at least some period of time. Was that something that you had an awareness of or was talked about? That transition?
Yes, it was. And there were many times when we would, where my father would be called away to attend to tribal business. We grew up in, not on the reserve, but off the reserve in central Ohio. And there's a long story associated with that, but that I won't go into here. But we, as a result of moving from the reserve down to Ohio, found ourselves pretty much alone at times when my father would be called away. At the same time, we felt a great sense of pride, knowing that when he was away, he was attending to his sheep, if you will.
Yeah, and maintaining that connection to the community in that ongoing way, even though you all were living elsewhere at the time. There's actually a very beautiful passage that mentions your father's need to travel at the beginning of chapter 11. And I was really struck by that because it's one of the moments when the parts of the book where your mother's clearly done the writing, but she's sort of passing on either things that he said or things that he did. And it begins this way. Throughout our years together, it was occasionally necessary for Gray Owl to travel without the family. Sometimes the trips kept him from home for several weeks. The government had declared its willingness to settle Indian land claims, and there were many conferences to ensure that all the papers were in order. Decisions needed to be made about what to do with the money, should it ever be forthcoming. And just parenthetically, this effort to achieve compensation from the government is something that continues even to this day. And then the passage goes on. A neighbor said indignantly, "I think that's terrible. How can he leave you and all these children? What does he think you live on?" And there's a lovely passage that follows just a little bit after that where she says, "When he returned, I told him about the neighbor's thoughts," and says, "He was not greatly disturbed, but said white people had a different philosophy. He said that our tradition taught long ago that all children belong to the Supreme Being and are only loaned to us. Also that grown people are their guardians on earth and have to trust that the Father of all will provide the necessities of life." He added that when he had to be absent, he simply said, "Father, here are your children. I leave them in your care," and went in full confidence that they would be provided for as well or better than he could do himself. I just thought that was such an interesting moment, both because of what it says, the words, your father's words, but also the way she's passing that on, passing on experience, passing on what was said and what was done. Like the book as a whole seems to be doing that in a lot of ways.
I think so. One of the things that is a reader might find interesting is the fact that as they wrote the book, the first and last chapter of the book were authored by my father, and the chapters in between were written by my mother, and as a result of many discussions that she and my father would have over the years in their quest to kind of answer the question, is it possible for us to live off reservation, keeping faith with our culture? And one of the important lessons that I think my father gave to us as siblings was this, and you find this in the first chapter entitled "The Call," and that is, let us first strip away the clutter that the storybooks have included about our past, for this is wisdom. If a man lose all he has, his wealth, his country, his hopes, and still may keep his secure knowledge of himself and his worth as a link in the chain of life, he has a rock to build upon. If all things be added unto him, wealth, position, fame, and power, and he have not the anchor of his heritage, he is an empty canoe upon the waters of life. That passage is really kind of been the anchor that I've had the benefit of using throughout my 70-some years living on this earth, to keep in mind who I am and my worth as an individual as a link in the chain of life, passing on to others those things that were given to me.
Yeah, that's beautifully put when you bring out that these are things that are given to you, but you're also, you said a link in a chain, and your father's own words actually just a few lines later kind of underline this. He says, "So let us with our memories first seek our heritage, our lovely past. I have a little knowledge, you, my brothers, have more." So there's this sense in which it's individual experience, individual knowledge of the self, but it's also, I guess you would say, relational. It's also deeply embedded in relationships, but also everyone is bringing something, right? I have a little knowledge, you, my brothers, have more, right? So if everybody is bringing what they have, there's an awful lot that ends up heaped up on the table.
Yes. One of the things that we had the opportunity of I guess, witnessing during our travel was as we went through the museum there in Berlin and Rotterdam, we had the chance to view some wampum belts. And I know that I've participated in discussions with folks about wampum, what it is and its purpose, and why it was so important to us. One of the things that most folks understand about wampum is that, of course, it was strips of beads made up of shell that one would find along the eastern seaboard. Tribes would fashion these beads very carefully. It took a lot of painstaking effort to make each bead individually, and then those beads would be highly sought after by not just Munsees, but tribes all over the country for the purpose of preparing belts. The belts most often, or many times, would be used as kind of to memorialize different events. In other words, they would say, for example, on the lives of my forebears, I promise to do whatever in treaties and in agreements and such. And what most people don't understand also is that probably the more important reason for the wampum was to serve as a way to record events through the use of ideographs that would be stitched using these different colored purple and white beads to record events that may have occurred during the life of a particular chief during that generation. I recall my father having spoken about those belts and their use whenever a chief would pass away. Then these belts would be brought out. Each generation they would be brought out and read, and it would take. In our case, it would take up to 9 days and 9 nights of reading continuously to go through the whole series of belts, generation upon generation, extolling the people about where we come from, essentially, and our heritage.
Yeah. Many people who know just a little bit about wampum will tend to assume, sometimes they'll assume that it was used as currency and that was the primary function. But that's not at all the case, even though there's obviously a value that was associated with wampum. As you mentioned, the beads took an awful lot of time to make and were precious for that reason. But if they know a little bit more, they'll know about wampum belts as agreements, as marking whether it's treaties or other kinds of agreements and acknowledgments between different nations or different bands and so on. But as you were saying, there's a whole other dimension where there's this kind of, like I think you said, memorialization or record-keeping function that was, if anything, at least as important or even more important than some of these other aspects. I think a lot of people are less familiar with that.
Yes.
And one of the things I was struck by is the ways in which that discussion of wampum in the, I think it's chapters 3 and 4, especially of the book, where there's that description of how there are patterns or ideographs that are woven into the pattern. There's a sense in which wampum is being set up here as almost in parallel with some of the other sources of knowledge that are discussed, books. Right? So that they're not the same as books, but they're a means of encoding knowledge that can be sort of put side by side with that, be all end all standard for Western civilization, the written book. And that dichotomy is discussed now and then in the book as well. One of the things that I was struck by in the chapters on wampum, chapters 3 and 4 especially, is how there's a discussion of what you mentioned already, the ways in which the wampum belts had this memorializing function through the patterns or ideographs that would be read then by someone who was knowledgeable and could, recount the history of each generation. And in around it's pages 28 and 29, there's this really interesting passage that describes how the reading would go. As you mentioned already, at the death of a chief, the readers would begin with the chief preceding the deceased and go back generation by generation. So in a kind of a reverse chronological order. And you mentioned already that it would take 9 days and 9 nights in some cases. And so it's a very substantial undertaking. But then just after that, she writes, over the years, I have found that this statement, that is this description of how the wampum was used, provokes predictable reactions and comments from an audience. She says, 1, quote an acceptable authority, author's name, publisher, volume, and page. 2, if such a record exists, it should be in a museum to protect it. 3, why don't you see if you can smuggle out a strip or two to prove your statement? And then there's an unpacking of responses to those questions. But what struck me about that passage is the ways in which there's a kind of, the book reflects an experience of being challenged by audiences, by listeners, by people who are not knowledgeable about the traditions that are described here. And this constant request for some kind of documentation to prove what is known through oral transmission. I don't know if that was an element of the book that is something that struck you a lot, or it could be that it strikes me frequently when I see these passages just because I'm interested in how does that work? How does the privilege of writing negatively impact other sources of knowledge that are transmitted orally?
Well, I think one of the things that strikes me as I read those chapters on wampum and other chapters as well is the idea that who is an authority?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I, as well as you, I've read a number of books written by people who have visited with Native Americans, indigenous people, way back as early as 16 and 1700. And they're looking at what they're seeing from the perspective of someone from outside. And that isn't necessarily an accurate depiction, but nonetheless, it's a perspective that's written down in the English language. And very often that will be accepted as fact more quickly than, say, an interpretation of the ideographs that one would see in a wampum belt. With the idea in mind that when you're reading a wampum, no two individuals may read it exactly the same. And so therefore, because it can't be read consistently exactly as it had been read by someone else, too often you see the word hoax used to describe what they're hearing, because it's just not written as the English language would be written in a book.
Yeah, and a number of times in this book, famous quote-unquote hoaxes are mentioned, things like the Wallam Olam and other kinds of texts that were published by non-Indigenous people in the 19th century. And these are texts that were seen initially as truthful, as verifiable, then come to be dismissed by a later generation of non-Indigenous scholars as, like I said, in quotation marks, a hoax. But the challenge is, how do we tell what are the elements that may reflect actual knowledge that was kept in the community and then passed into the hands of a non-Indigenous person who published some version of it? It's very difficult to untangle that history, but I think that seems to be one element of the work that your parents were doing. We're really trying to untangle, using those books, using all these different sources of knowledge to try to get at what they call this Indian traditional knowledge.
Yeah, and I think one of the sad things about the book and about what one would experience on reservations living in Indian communities is that the answers to those questions are very often lost to us because the old people who would pass on that knowledge have gone. They're passed on. And there was for quite a number of years, I would say a whole generation of people on reservations who understood. It was not something that was viewed as being very popular to be indigenous. It was something that was certainly looked down upon and discouraged in the residential schools to speak one's language, to kind of do anything that would kind of show that they were remembering who they were as Native American.
Yeah, your mother makes reference in the introduction to exactly that sort of specter of the residential schools, right? That terrible threat, where she mentions, speaking of Gray Owl, she says when he was 6 years old and before the authorities could capture him for school, he was taken from his mother and put under the direction of the old men of his tribe in order that he might learn the wisdom of his father. So she's telling how that traditional knowledge was passed on, but it's kind of under the shadow, I guess you might say, of this other form of schooling, which is in fact more of a work camp in many cases.
Right.
Yeah.
I recall one story that he told about his experience with the residential school. This was the first day he attended the school in which he was being introduced to the students by his teacher. And he didn't at the time speak a word of English. And after he was introduced, he said to the students in his language, "I'll never learn this ugly tongue." And of course, the students laughed. And the teacher, thinking that he was making a joke of her, took and beat him in front of all the other students until his hands were so sore and raw, and then pushed him in the closet. And he was unable to open the door. So he spent the whole night in the closet, kind of reflecting on what had just happened to him.
Yeah. It makes me think about that specific experience, but also other experiences of that period of life, how that might have shaped your father and then your parents' decision to raise your big family elsewhere. You mentioned you were raised largely in Ohio, and also Detroit was part of your family's life a little before that. And I'm really struck by how, even though they were physically away from the reserve, there's this real sense in which they were not just maintaining, but actually building out their life with a strong sense of identity, individual and community-based identity, even though physically they weren't continuing to be on the reserve itself.
I was struck by that. One would think that those of us who did not grow up on the reservation would be at a distinct disadvantage compared to others who did. What I've observed, however, is that because of what I had, insofar as my father and his having taught us the things that one would see written in this book, people on the reserve did not have the advantage of the elders teaching them those things. For some reason or other, they didn't. That it just was not passed on or not sought out. And I saw that here at this symposium when I spoke of different things that one from the reserve should have remembered. But upon hearing me talk about the False Face Society or the wampum or other aspects of tribal life, it was kind of an opening of eyes, that opening of the door of knowledge that had not been opened previously to them.
That's such an important point, and it makes me wonder if, you were talking a moment ago about your father's residential school experience. I wonder how much of a role that the fact that many people from Munsee-Delaware were sent either to Mount Elgin or to one of the other residential schools. One of the things that listeners might be interested in is seeing that book Nindalok, I Work, which is on boys and girls labor at Mount Elgin Residential School, and it makes it really clear how, as you said earlier, John, language, traditional knowledge, all those things were not just discouraged, but like beaten out of children. And so that becomes internalized, and there becomes perhaps a real hesitation to pass on knowledge. And that's enough to break that chain, I guess.
Yes, yes.
And just coming back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, when we were talking specifically about wampum, but we were also talking about how to disentangle and to retrieve traditional knowledge that might have gotten all intertwined with and obscured by its reception as published written texts by non-Indigenous writers. There's a sense in which belongings get talked about in a very similar way in this book. I'm noticing here, for example, and this is in the same chapter we were looking at a little bit earlier. Here I'm on page 42, where your parents write this. It was during that era and such a climate that libraries began to fill with dissertations on the, quote, lore of the Indian, end quote. Every historian competed to define the Indian way of life, and each had his stable of informants, as he called them. Museums accumulated such a plethora of arrowheads, baskets, pottery, canoes, cradleboards, tomahawks, and other gear that they are able to draw from their storehouses even today a wealth of material for new exhibits. The picture that emerged was that of a race which had existed in a vacuum with no experience save the day-to-day scrabble for existence, a race without literature, history, or invention. That's such a troublesome but also really accurate description of what museums have done in terms of extracting belongings. And that's something we had the opportunity both to reflect on and also to begin to repair in that time we were together at the American Museum of Natural History last month with about 70 members of the Munsee-speaking Lenape communities. Is that something that your family talked about much? Like there's some descriptions of museum visits in this book.
It was. I think that the difficulty we ran into was that these things that one would find in museums were more curiosities, if you will, than anything else, than actual things that had any spiritual value. Cradle boards, for example, would be an example of something that would be very spiritual, given what it was used for and how it was made, and the care and love that was put into it. Yet, when you look in museums, you might see any number of cradle boards, but there's no mention in there about any of that intrinsic value that is attached to it, the spiritual value that it holds. I think that it goes some way to kind of address the problem that most museums now encounter in trying to interpret for non-Indigenous public what the culture is, not just what the item is, but how it was used and how it was regarded by members of the community. What I noticed in our interaction with the people at the American Museum of Natural History was they had extended an invitation to tribal members to participate in identifying items that would go into displays in various places within the museum. And although that was a very thoughtful gesture, to tribal members, it was a very painful reminder that they do not have these items, that they don't belong to the tribe anymore, but that they reside and belong to the museum. And the museum was extending an invitation to these non-academics to offer their views about them.
Yeah, I think somebody there put it that it was as if someone came into your house and stole your things and took them to their house and then invited you to come over and visit with them, and it's like, thanks. but there's something much more fundamental here that has to be thought through about, the belongings and who they belong to and what that entails and how that can be made right.
And I think that one of the things that came out of the discussion was the idea that perhaps there could be some middle ground sought where items that one would find in a museum that would be of great spiritual significance and value to tribes could be given back to the tribes from whence they came. And then if the museum had a need for a display, then in consultation with the tribe could recreate the item in a way and such that it would not be of equal value as the ancient ones that were taken away from them.
Yeah, so there's an actual kind of relationship, a positive relationship that gets established between the community and the museum, and through the museum to the museum goers. Like it seems that there's a tremendous capacity for growth, mutual understanding, and I don't want to paint it in too rosy colors, but there seems to be a lot of positive potential there if it's done in a good way and in a respectful way, in a way that's kind of led by the community's own priorities.
Yes, it's a question of whose culture, who will be in a position to identify what their culture is, and extend information about that to non-Indigenous people, to the extent that they're comfortable.
Exactly. And yeah, the book does have this wonderful way of moving between addressing non-Indigenous people and kind of suggesting ways these things could be done better, but also sometimes very much explicitly addressing, it'll say Indians, it'll be very explicit in that way. And I wondered if you had thoughts about that. I was really struck by the way in which the book seems to me to be kind of moving between different audiences at different moments. Is that something you notice when you read the book? Because I know it's a book you've lived with so many years. And as you say, even before the physical book itself, these are teachings that were in your household in a daily way.
Yes, very much so. I suppose going back to that one chapter that my father had written.
The beginning one, you mean, or the end one?
The chapter 1, where he says, "For what, my people, do we hunger? When the stranger offers us bread, why do we turn on him in bitter pride and cry, 'It is a stone, away with it'? When one comes fawning and says insidiously, 'Oh, I know the Indian and his glory, how he could ride and fight and hunt, how cunning upon the trail of his enemy, how canny his nature lore, how true and enduring his friendship. What is this reticence that lifts our heads and whispers in our hearts, you never knew us?' And those who come wringing their hands, crying aloud the guilt of their ancestors for taking the lands of the first and true Americans, why do we stiffen and draw back from their vain apologies? What is this faint stirring of grief, this half-forgotten memory of something infinitely more precious than the land? Think, my brothers, and remember. Open your eyes, old ones, and wake from your dreaming. Wake and remember your fathers and the true glory of your past. And do not stop with the history books, where one man's opinion caught your people in a small moment and left you there impaled upon a fragment of time. This goes to addressing what you're talking about, where the book shifts in addressing these things to, and not to non-Indigenous, but to Indigenous people, to think back into the legends, the farthest reaches of their legends, to come to a remembrance of who they are.
Yeah, no, that's such a powerful, powerful passage. I'm so glad that you read that. And that last sentence, do not stop with the history books where one man's opinion caught your people in a small moment. That's such a perfectly focused way of kind of pointing at all that's wrong with that tradition and the possibilities that exist when the people, I guess, rise up, right? When there's a kind of response and a renewal.
Yes. And again, the hard part is, where does one look? If those that had passed on this knowledge are no longer available, no longer around. They passed on. And that's one of the things that the book addresses to some extent. And then, it goes in some ways that I suppose, or at least offers some options to people. Where does one look? On one hand, it talks about one could look in books. One could look in legends if you have them.
They talk about books and legends as sources of knowledge, but also I wonder maybe also belongings. Do you think that's also one of the places that's kind of gestured to? Relics is the word that gets used in the book, but I wonder if we could extend that to think about belongings.
Yes, ancestor belongings would be a source of information.
John, it's been so good to talk about Cry of the Ancients with you and to just reflect on the contributions of your parents. And also, I have to say, looking here at a physical copy of the book of your brother who did the beautiful cover art and illustrations that are in the book, it's clearly a loving product of the whole family that book carries forward.
Yes, and Daniel, who recently passed away a couple of years ago, was so proud to be able to contribute in this way. His talent in the production of the book.
Yeah, and it's beautiful to think also about the way that family contribution goes on. Like when I hear you interpret your sense of certain passages or certain parts of the book, I think how wonderful it would be to hear, for example, you read a chapter and then maybe comment on it. And perhaps there's other members of the family who would have commentaries to offer that would allow us to see both the particular kind of knowledge that's passed on in the book, but also the way of doing things that's passed on in the book, which to me was like maybe the most, I don't know, the thing that struck me the most is the ways of doing things, this way of navigating the world and seeking out traditional knowledge in all these different places.
Yes.
But thank you so much for spending time in conversation together. I really appreciate it and look forward to keep on doing things together through the Munsee Symposium, through this maybe preparing ways to get this book out to wider readership and maybe more travels.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me to participate.
Well, that was lovely.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk together with John. We'd had conversations in the past about his parents' book, Cry of the Ancients, but unfolding it with listeners in mind is a very different experience. So I'm so glad we got to do that.
And I just loved hearing him read out passages from the book. I could listen to that all day.
He has a beautiful voice. People remark on this all the time. In fact, just this past weekend, members of Munsee-Delaware Nation had the chance to listen to a slightly longer, lightly edited version of this conversation. And afterward, people all said, "Wow, John, could you read out this thing or that thing?" Everybody responds to him in that way. It's kind of magical.
That is fantastic. And I'm glad that our little bonus episode conversations with people who are not us are back on the table. So hopefully there will be even more of those in the future.
Yeah, I actually loved it when we were doing that a little bit more frequently in connection with our past clusters, because sometimes they would just sort of fill out an area that we had a little bit opened up but not fully expanded on. And sometimes they would take us in the most unexpected directions, which I absolutely loved.
Yeah. Well, listeners, we hope you enjoyed it too. In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can always email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We would always love to hear from you. And this show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon. And patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. Find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/86b. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.